Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. We're right back into our conversations about the new series that I worked on, Death on the Lot, hosted by Adam McKay. I was the editor on this series, Death on the Lot, which looks at changes and tragedy in Hollywood to help explain the way the country as a whole was transformed in the 40s and 50s after World War II. Last episode, we talked about unions being corrupted and red-baited in this era. There are other episodes of Death on the Lot about the treatment of women in Hollywood and the changing nature of fame and James Dean and method acting and lots more. It's a really great series. And there is also an episode about race and civil rights, told through the story of one actress whose name you may know, Hattie McDaniel. Hattie McDaniel was the first black person to win an Oscar for her role in Gone with the Wind. She'd kind of carved out a role in Hollywood for portraying maids and mammies. The mammy was a trope that often reinforced a lot of racist stereotypes, though Hattie put her own spin on those roles, and those roles were really the only ones that were available to her when she was building her career as an actress in the 30s and 40s. But she wins the Oscar, a trailblazing moment, and then kind of nothing. Her career kind of stalls out. She doesn't get much more work, and she also starts to get criticized by members of the burgeoning civil rights movement for those roles that she had taken on, which they saw as portraying racist stereotypes. So her story is really fascinating on its own, but also a really interesting way to get at how portrayals of and opportunity for black people were changing in the years after the war. And for the country as a whole, the way that a new generation of civil rights activists was thinking about the post-war civil rights movement and their relationship with the previous generation of black leaders. So let's talk about the career of Hattie McDaniel. Back with me are the two writers of Death on the Lot. Brian Steele is back, as is Hadley Meares, who wrote this episode on Hattie McDaniel, back here as well. Hello there. Thanks for doing this, and congratulations once again on the launch of the new series.
Thank you.
Thank you. You too.
Hadley, you want to start with the kind of key moment here, which is the moment that Hattie McDaniel wins the Oscar. It's the height of her career, but she's not allowed to sit with the rest of the cast of the movie, right? So take us inside the hall on that Oscar awards night.
Absolutely. So she's been nominated for Best Supporting Actress for Gone with the Wind. She's so excited, and she comes with her escort, who was also a person of color. So they were the only two black folks at the ceremony. And she is escorted to the back of the ballroom, basically, and sits at a table, not with her co-stars, not with Vivien Leigh, not with Clark Gable, but kind of on an island of her own. And then when her name is called up to give her speech, she has to kind of wade through the crowds to give her acceptance speech. And, she handles that acceptance speech with such grace. It's such a powerful, beautiful speech. And the way she was able to navigate that ceremony is really, to me, the way she tried to navigate her entire career in Hollywood, right? She was continuously facing all of these racist aggressions, and she just powered through, went up, and delivered a great performance, notwithstanding what was going on around her and how she was being treated.
Yeah. Now, one would think you win an Oscar, you're probably at the peak of your powers. But of course, a big part of the story, the reason we want to tell this story, is that in the aftermath of winning this Oscar, Hattie is largely shut out from Hollywood. She doesn't get a ton of big roles. She, in fact, maybe you could argue her career regresses in some sort of weird way. And obviously we get into this in depth, but explain that to us. How is that possible?
I think that what happened to Hattie, is that the Oscar, in a lot of ways, of course she deserved it. Her performance is outstanding, but it was also a way of the industry fending off the NAACP and other organizations that were saying, we don't like the way you treat black performers. So what better way to be like, oh, no, she's one of us. Look, we gave her an Oscar. But they weren't really going to change the way they actually portrayed black folks. And so she was not going to be given many other roles besides a maid or a mammy or a housekeeper. It just wasn't going to happen, because Hollywood has long had this thing where we pretend we're super progressive, but then really we're not that progressive, and we're doing what we think, white, middle-class, conservative America wants to see. And so Hattie was really a victim of all of that. And she also becomes a victim, especially by the mid 40s, of what we talked about in the last episode, of people coming back from the war and saying, this is unacceptable the way we're treated. And Black people especially said, this is ridiculous. We're not going to be treated like this anymore. We're not going to be portrayed, in these horrible stereotypes anymore. And that was Hattie's bread and butter, and that's what she knew how to do. So she wasn't going to get these few precious new, more progressive roles that were being slowly developed for Black actors either. So she was kind of just shit out of luck at all angles.
Hadley, we get into this in the series, pretty in depth, but just give people a taste of what the criticism from, say, the NAACP in particular was of the roles that Hattie McDaniel played, and including the one that she won the Oscar for.
Well, the criticisms of the roles that Hattie played were very substantial. I mean, they were criticisms that were true. It was that she always played servants or mammies, maids, whatever you want to say, that were in servitude to white people. She usually played maids that loved the people who kept her in servitude or loved the people who kept her enslaved. And they were very broad a lot of times, not always. Hattie did some very subtle work when she was allowed to, which was very rarely. And so, it was an incredibly damaging stereotype that she was portraying. It was, because it was a stereotype that was telling white audiences, hey, this is okay. Look, this is just life and she loves this. And it was even more kind of disgustingly telling Black audiences, because there were very few Black films at the time, very, very few, and they were hard to find. So they were going to movies too. And this was the way they were seeing themselves portrayed. So the NAACP was fighting against something that was very real and very detrimental. But I think they put too much blame on Hattie, who was one female performer on her own, who loved to act and was doing the best she could.
It just had to work.
Yeah, yeah. And we point out in the series that her response was, in many ways, this is the work that was available to me, and I was making progress in the way that I could. And moreover, the conversation needs to be about the larger system, not about the one actor at the heart of it.
Right. It wasn't her responsibility to change things. It was the studio's responsibility.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting the world together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
I remember when we were first talking about this episode, but also about the series overall. And, we're always trying to find ways to make it relevant to today and to look at history on a continuum. And I remember digging into, okay, so this is, war, post-war America. Well, it seemed to me that the numbers would line up that the last of former slaves would still be alive and dying at that time. And that is the case, that really some of the last people that lived in bondage were dying right in the 40s, and then a couple kind of straggled on after that. And when you think about now, I certainly my parents were born right after the war. And to think about my parents basically overlapped then with the last people alive who actually were slaves. It makes you realize that all of this just isn't that long ago. And so when we talk about the ugliness of what Hattie went through, this is not ancient history. I mean, this is really something that, people that are still alive today were alive then, that is still baked into the cake of so much of what's around our society that maybe we've kind of pasted over, or maybe it's been ripped open in the last few years. But it's so relevant to today because as much as we've tried to pretend like we've moved on, this is all within a lifetime, within 2 lifetimes, within a few generations. And it's why I think that what we try to unpack with these series that we're doing are so interesting and meaningful, because this is all interconnected.
But also, that generational shift is such a powerful force. And I mean, the Hattie story is a part of that too, right? I mean, a big part of the tension around what Hattie McDaniel represented to the Black community was coming from, as you said, Hadley, people coming back from the war, on the one hand saying, we just fought for this country against fascism, and now we're coming back to a segregated country, right? That sort of seems in many ways similar to what we saw over, in Europe. And moreover, a new generation of Black activists and this is, the rise of the modern civil rights movement, new generation of Black activists looking at Hattie as antiquated and saying the game that you played, which was to work the system and to, appease and find your niche, that game is over for us, right? Now we want to forge new territory. And so as much as it's all connected, it's also a story of rapid generational shift. And that's kind of where it ties into this big fracturing that we're exploring in the series as a whole in terms of what happens post-war.
Yeah, and I think that, there wasn't much grace given to Hattie about her. Both of her parents were born enslaved. So she just came at everything from a totally different perspective than a lot of folks who have been born even 20 years after. I mean, I just don't think people can understand what that mentality of growing up. I mean, I would never know in a zillion years, and I always feel weird talking about this stuff since I'm not a Black person and I have no idea what any of this is like. But I do feel bad for Hattie in that she wasn't given the grace. And I think you see that in modern times today, too, that a lot of times there's social progress that's needed and necessary. Those of us who believe in that progress give very little grace to people who had very different experiences growing up and came from a very different place, that it takes a while for them to change their minds. And maybe they did what they had to do because that was all they could do when they were coming up. So I think it's something that happens again and again, is that we kind of discard the forebears and the pioneers that went before us when they can't quite latch on to what we believe is the next step in progressing towards civil rights.
Mm-hmm.
So certainly, the way that Hollywood is thinking about race is changing in this moment, and Hattie is kind of caught in between this shift, which is a big part of the story. And I feel like a lot of our episodes are about characters like that, right? Characters who maybe planted their feet in one era and then everything shifted under their feet and then they suffered consequences or were unable to adjust, And so we should give people a taste. But I mean, certainly we do that with regards to fame. I mean, Brian, we talk about the guy who first played Superman, right? And how he felt a level of fame and a new kind of fame after the war that just simply didn't exist maybe in the previous era. And that had real consequences.
Yeah, George Reeves is who we're talking about, who played Superman on The Adventures of Superman, and was something of a sensation on the early days of television before dying in a very unseemly way that with a lot of mystery or surrounding it, or maybe no mystery depending on who you talk to, which we certainly unpack in the episode. But yeah, fame was transforming at the time. I mean, this was the explosion of tabloid media was happening right around then, and then also different types of celebrity, because you had film, and then as we unpack, suddenly there's a television in every living room, and so there's more avenues to fame. And there's also the birth of kind of just like this insidious desire to just be famous for fame itself. And there's some characters kind of circling George Reeves in the story we tell that are like that. They're the kind of like early just tabloid figures. And then George Reeves was a perfect example of someone who all of a sudden was shepherded into television and felt deep shame about it, but also just the real ugliness and emptiness underneath it all. And this was just a really consequential time for it.
Yeah.
What do they say? Like, fame is a mask that eats your face from the inside or something.
They say that?
It's some quote I've heard, and I think it's really true.
Should have used that in the series, yeah.
I know, because I think that, fame's a motherfucker, and it really messes with your head. And stars in the 20s and 30s and 40s still had sort of a screen in front of them. They could, there was some famous street, I think it was Bedford in Beverly Hills, but don't quote me on that, where like Jimmy Stewart, Lucille Ball, all these people just lived on one of the flat streets in Beverly Hills, and their kids would run around and play together. There were no gates. There were, if people drove by, fans drove by, nobody bothered them. And I mean, you can't imagine that today. Everybody lives on these high hills with these crazy gates. And so I think as fame, as people became more and more accessible, especially through the TV, right? You're not going out on a special night to go see this person's giant face in front of you. You're sitting at home watching them on a tiny little TV. So it feels like they're more part of your family instead of this kind of idol or god that you shouldn't really you would never dare even talk to because they're not even really real. Yeah. And so I think that's where a lot of fame got even trickier because you didn't have that level of that barrier of kind of idolhood or mythic proportions anymore.
So that's how the series, we get into the changing nature of fame, but we also touch on, as you heard in the last episode, labor. We touch on, help me out here, we touch on gender and how it changed, or gender dynamics did not change as much as we'd hoped. We touch on, obviously, race and civil rights. We touch on cars with James Dean. We touch on acting itself with the rise of the method, which was, really destabilizing and had all sorts of political contours as well. So, I think we paint the picture, I'd like to think, of a really changing America and the way that you can identify that within the entertainment industry. As we wrap up, I like to ask this question of anyone who does historical work. And I'm especially curious because, as we touched on last episode, we're living in a moment of radical change within Hollywood. Does looking at moments like this scare you or give you comfort? I think that's my question.
Interesting. In a sense, it gives comfort that we keep on winding ourselves into these difficult moments and situations, and somehow time carries on and we're still here. But it also does feel like things are spinning out in a faster and faster way and in a direction of more and more chaos in a sense. And so I don't know that it gives me comfort. It gives a way to kind of perceive things and see that, we keep on doing these same things over and over again. And so I guess there are ways through, but boy, I don't know. I'm doing the work these days in my own life of trying to get in touch with optimism again and clearly floundering. We talk about the labor fight, being out fighting for something just, however small, feels good in this chaotic world we live in. And whether we win this labor fight or not, it feels good to try to do something concrete.
Guess what? It's mine. I'm not going to be that positive. But I love history more than anything in the world because I find it so comforting. Not that I find it comforting in terms of, humanity prevails, but I just find it comforting that it's happened before and it's all so small and so meaningless. Like there's a great scene in Vertigo where Kim Novak points to like the lines on a tree and she says, "This is where I was born. This is where I died." And it's just this like tiny little piece of one tiny little circle. And so what I really love about history is you can like say, okay, we're going to take a snapshot of Hollywood in the 1950s, like we do in this series. And just within the snapshot of people who died tragically in the 1950s, you can find all of these human dramas and all of these small stories that link to what was going on to this great nation, which won't even matter in 1,000 years. So I find it really comforting in a sense that we're all just humans having a human experience for like 80 years and then we're dead.
Great. Well, if that doesn't cause you to run to your podcast app and download Death on the Lot, I don't know what does. But seriously, I, once again, really, really great work. It was just so much fun to make. You two were the engines behind this series. So I hope people go and listen. I hope this gives people a taste of the really, impressive, sweeping, in-depth work that was done here. But Brian Steele, Hadley Meares, thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jody. Appreciate it.
Radiotopia.